Hello and welcome to Darkling Radio Darkling number 26. The Darkling podcast, of course, is a sister show to Dark Days Radio where we explore in-depth topics into the world of darkness and also explore other game systems. Tonight, of course, I'm your host, Mike, and I'm joined by Chris. How's it going, Chris?
Good. It seems like autumn has officially arrived where I am. It has been pretty much rain, and rain. Yeah, good. I'm quite happy, yeah, because I've actually had my first session back role-playing this week. So I ran a bit of Vampire, so I'm quite happy.
Awesome.
And I've been
good.
reading a certain book, so we'll get into that very soon.
Indeed. And in the right corner, we've got Simon Berman. How's it going, Simon?
Good.
Now, Simon is the community manager and a writer for Privateer Press, who are very well known for their Iron Kingdoms role-playing game, which just had a new edition released, and also the Hordes and Warmachine tabletop miniatures games.
That is absolutely correct. I'm one of the staff writers and the community coordinator there, so I have a lot of hats.
Mm-hmm.
So, in this episode, we're going to be discussing the new Iron Kingdoms role-playing game. But before we get started with that, Simon, could you give us a little bit of your geek cred?
Sure. I've been playing RPGs since 1993, so almost 20 years, which is sort of an alarming thing to say out loud for the first time.
Yeah.
So sort of back, would have been 2nd edition D&D, and then I played an awful lot of vampire games over most of the late 90s, which is probably the RPGs I played the most of. Played a bunch of miniatures games. I've been playing tabletop games pretty much since 1993, off and on. Found Warmachine as a player back in 2006. Shortly thereafter, I was a press ganger, which is one of our volunteers. And not too long after that, I moved out from New York to Seattle, where I now work at the company.
We're going to have to, at some point in future, pick your brains on your gaming background with Vampire, but let's definitely talk about the main thing, which, as Mike said, we have this new edition of Iron Kingdoms, which I picked up earlier this week, and it's very, very big, and it's very pretty. And yeah, it definitely has a new book smell, which I've not enjoyed much recently because I've been buying PDFs. So,
right.
Cool.
Yeah, we're pretty excited to have the new RPG out. Privateer, we actually got our start with the Iron Kingdoms as a D20 supplement back in, I guess, 2000. The company's we've been around 12 years now.
Yeah,
that was long before my time, clearly, but many of the people involved are still here. Matt Wilson, our founder, still runs the company, and he's highly involved in the creative direction. Jason Souls, who's the lead developer of Warmachine, he's been here since pretty much the beginning as well. So, there was a long period of time where we were doing the RPG, and we had the Iron Kingdoms character guide and world guide, and of course the Witchfire trilogy, which were, I believe, our first supplements, which is a D20 campaign, which acted not just as a sort of D&D campaign, but also as a kind of a setting primer for the Iron Kingdoms as it was being developed. So, we really had our roots as a role-playing game company, although Warmachine, our miniatures game, was being developed more or less in tandem at that point. But for various reasons, the RPG came out first. But those two things were informing each other's development all the time. Eventually, it made sense for us to focus more on Warmachine and its sister game, Hordes, which are, of course, set in the same world of the Iron Kingdoms, but various things, including the end of the OGL, the new edition of Dungeons & Dragons, made sense for us to sort of slow down on that and then start apprising the situation for coming up with our own core version of the Iron Kingdoms rules, which was a really cool thing for us because in a lot of ways the D20 setting, or rather the D20 system didn't entirely speak to the kind of world and gameplay we wanted.
Yeah, I was going to say I know exactly the same thing when you said about how with the end of it, that need to jump ship, and I've experienced that with other role play games that were around that time. So I totally understand the need to do that.
Yeah, I think even if things hadn't gone down that way, we probably would have gone this route eventually anyway, just because we really did want to have a game system that would let us play the game we saw it in our heads. When I came on in 2008, some of the first writing I did for Privateer was in our magazine for No Quarter magazine, and I did some of the last D20 supplemental articles we wrote on Warjack factories, and it was more background heavy than gameplay stuff. But even then, we were discussing what we'd like to see in the system, how we could do things more true to our vision.
Indeed. But I think it's important to bring up that the fact that Iron Kingdom started off with the D20 system right as it exploded really, I think, helped out Privateer Press as a company and helped really just get the setting and the ideas out there.
Oh, yeah, no, I think it was a great move for a number of reasons, although I'm sort of hesitant to speak too much about the old days just because it was, a solid 8 years before I started working at Privateer.
Right.
But maybe one of these days we'll get somebody who, like Doug Seacat would be a great guy to talk about because he was involved in some of the original setting stuff, and he's still our lead writer and one of our main continuity guys.
Great.
Good stuff. So, yeah, let's talk about the new book and kind of the overarching structure and ideas that go along with it. So, I think probably the most critical thing is that the fact that combat specifically takes place with miniatures, just like in the Hordes and Warmachine tabletop games. There's more detail, obviously, but it really has the same basic engine driving it. I think this is a great idea, by the way. A lot of cool RPGs have done this before. Classically, you've got Mech Warrior in the Time of War for the Battletech board game, which that's the RPG system. You've got Heavy Gear as well, did kind of the same thing, marrying both the tabletop game and the RPG originally. I don't know if they still, just as a side note, I don't know if they still publish RPG material for that game. Yeah, anyway. And, of course, there's this Dungeons & Dragons, which did the same thing.
I've heard about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, actually, original D&D came out of wargaming, and, I think our game is slightly distinguished from other games that when you do choose to use it, the tactical miniatures portion of it, you use a tape measure. Although obviously any range in the game is also can be transferred into feet. 1 inch equals 6 feet approximately. But we use the tape measure or ruler for combat, and it's been sort of funny at conventions and stuff, seeing some of like the old school gamers, their eyes kind of light up when they get memories of very early Dungeons and Dragons games where you did the same thing.
Excellent. Yeah, because having read through the initial starter PDF that's available on the Privateer site, and gone through reading the combat system, I'm having trouble to even realize how much has changed. Because my experience of Warmachine is back with first edition kind of Prime, and so I'm just wondering, how much should I look out for in the evolution of the combat system and the mechanics from the actual tabletop war game?
Sure. I think we use the core of Warmachine to make our RPG rules, although we added a lot of granularity to it to make it make sense as a role-playing game and give players the sort of individual and meaningful choices on the tabletop that they would want from their individual character, and not sort of a nameless, faceless grunt in the war game. So, I can't think of too many specific places we've changed it, or broad places we've changed it. There's lots of details that have been changed, and I would actually strongly recommend that if you're a Warmachine player and you're coming over to the RPG, read the rules very carefully, because some abilities may have the same name and the same basic idea, but they may function a little bit differently. And there's some standardization that we added to the RPG. For example, characters can charge through each other, through friendly characters, things like that you are exceptions to the rules in Warmachine. But again, one of the things we really do is that we like the core mechanics of Warmachine. We understand them really well because we've been perfecting them for almost a decade now. In fact, it'll be 10 years of Warmachine is next year. So it's a mechanical system that we really understand, and our developers really had their heads wrapped around. So it made sense for us to sort of transfer it over. As well, a lot of the way we see the Iron Kingdoms the gameplay of it comes out of Warmachine and Hordes. So it was just a question of sort of adding the detail orientation to it to make it an RPG. And we had some pretty interesting new systems we've added as well, like the feat point system. Every character starts the game with 3 feat points, and these can be used to do things like heroic dodges or to get an extra die to roll on your attack. And you get them back for doing things like rolling critical successes, for destroying enemies, or at the GM's discretion. So it's
I was going to say
cool
that seemed, when I read that, the feat points, I was immediately taken back to the stunting in Exalted. I just got the same kind of feel of like it's basically telling you use them to do cool things, and if you do cool things, you'll get them back as well. So it really promotes players to take risks and to describe cool stuff, and
absolutely
add some, like, rather than just hanging back and like carefully hoarding your resources for something. This instead is like, actually use them and beat the living snot out of something, and or describe in wonderful graphic detail how it's happening, and then if it all works out cool, then you'll get more back and you can do even more crazy stuff. So I really like that. It basically just it promotes really ballsy kind of gameplay and storytelling.
Yeah. I think the thing that I always advise new players with is use your feat points, because the combat is actually it's a very potentially deadly game. It's quite easy if you're not using your feat points to have a bad run where things don't go so well for you. But if you're using them, and you should be gaining more, it's kind of an economy there. You really want to be spending them, and the throughput of feat points is really important to having a good time with the game. But again, good planning is always going to help you out in RPG. If you get the jump on the bad guys, there's a lot of situational benefits that you'll have there. So I wouldn't advise people to rush blindly into combat and start flinging feat points around willy-nilly, but they're there to give you an edge, or to make you able to be sure that your next attack is probably going to hit.
Cool. And another thing to bring up about this system, just kind of another broad, overarching thing, for people that haven't played Hordes and Warmachine, is it's basically a 2d6 bell curve system. So you have you roll 2d6, add your stat, and then compare it to a target number, which may be like an opponent's defense, or maybe a set target number from the storyteller or game master. But the cool thing is that if it looks like you're going to have to get like a 10 or something on 2d6, there are some cases where you can actually boost that, and you throw in another die, so you roll 3d6 instead, which increases your chances. And that kind of adds some kind of currency to the game, and gives you some extra options as you're going through and playing. So that's pretty cool as well. And I'm always a big fan of 2d6 systems, especially since I've become a really huge Battletech fan in the last couple of years. It's always good to see.
Yeah, it's a really fast system. I mean, it's anyone that's not played Warmachine, as far as tabletop games concerned, wargaming wise, Warmachine is as long as you're playing, like, say, with the typical kind of like battle groups, is incredibly like fast to play and rewarding. And so to see the rule system being used for a role play game just fills me with glee that I can get through lots of exciting combat nice and quickly.
Yeah, I think the combat resolves very fast. I think almost surprisingly fast for some RPG players, which is nice for me because I think the combat's satisfying and you get to do a lot of very cool things, but you're not going to spend a lot of time consulting charts or tables to figure out how it works.
There's no roll to hit, then roll to dodge, then roll to damage, then roll to soak, and then roll to do something else, and then something else triggers. It's all kind of it's all in the one roll, and that's one of the strengths that I thought went into New World of Darkness when that came out, and it's nice to see that same thing carrying over into also being in Iron Kingdoms and carrying over from the war game, because I hate rolling too many things for a single combat resolution.
No, we have it pretty streamlined. It's you roll to hit, you roll your damage, and generally that's it. A lot of characters will have sort of passive abilities and benefits that will make them harder to hit, but that tends to interact on all in one player's turn. So there isn't a lot of back and forth there, which makes things very streamlined. Which was one of the things when we were releasing our second edition of Warmachine in 2010. Streamlining was a big thing for us because we had a lot of abilities that were very similar and had similar effects, but different names and slightly different wordings, and we took a lot of trouble to go back and make all of that language consistent. So, I think it's interesting. One of the things we found since we've released the game is a lot of players I wouldn't say a lot of players, but a certain percentage of players come on our forums and they ask questions about the rules, and in a lot of cases they're actually overthinking the implications of the rules, when in fact if you read them literally as they're written, that's exactly how they're expected to be played out. So it's I think people are some sort of often surprised by how clear our rules actually are and how literal they are.
Excellent.
Good stuff. Cool. And we've talked enough about combat, and I do have one other broad question. And Simon, I've seen you kind of answer this a little bit on RPG.net. So there's no social stat in the game, which is a little surprising, and it's definitely confused a lot of people. Could you kind of talk about like some of the design discussions that you guys had? Because that seems like it's quite a departure from a lot of RPGs these days.
Sure. Basically, we didn't want to have a single social stat because we felt it creates the kind of play where one character makes the character who is your social guy or your face, and his dump stat becomes strength or something that other characters wouldn't use. And whenever your party gets into some kind of social altercation, the face character is often able to, despite being often considered the role-playing character, often totally circumnavigates the role-playing by saying, well, I make my negotiation roll, I automatically succeed because, my numbers are so good on this, and we can move on to the next fight. And it's sort of an odd counterintuitive thing I've noticed in a lot of role-playing games over the years, where that social stat actually discourages role-playing, because mechanically the game supports one character or a number of characters maxing a stat to just sort of get what they want instead of having to, role-play out negotiations and stuff. So our take on that was that while we have, I think, 10 plus sort of social skills like negotiation, bribery, seduction, etc., the stat you use is situational, determined by you and the game master at the time of it coming up. So, for example, if your character is trying to intimidate somebody, if they're in a city, your character might choose intellect to come up with a sort of particularly cutting and underhanded threat. This is a really nice business you've got here. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. And in that case, you'd add the intellect to the roll. Alternately, say a big burly trollkin, he might not want to go that route, and so he's going to just flex his muscles, look menacingly at his axe, and he's going to roll his strength as his intimidation roll. And this allows the player and the GMs, who have to agree on everything in these cases, but to make to at least basically describe the route they're taking on the social roll, the circumstances of it, and what the appropriate response is. And in some cases, it doesn't make sense because a character who has a very high poise, might be impressive and well-spoken, but that's not going to impress a bunch of Thorn barbarians who are much more likely to be impressed by the Trollkin and his strength.
Cool. That all makes that's all great. I mean, I have absolutely no problem with that. That's I think really a good route forward, because I mean, again, as you said, it means even the Trollkin character, who in a more classic system would be considered the bit of the uncouth kind of character, is useful in the right context. They are the one that you send up to intimidate a whole gang of people, but they're certainly not the person you then use if you need to have some more tact. So it means all characters are useful in the right social scenario.
Right, and better yet, the Trollkin can still be intimidating and make that kind of social role without having compromised his ability in combat, which is probably what that player is most interested in doing.
Yeah.
Cool, good stuff. Hey, Chris, you've got the book. Have you read through the archetypes and careers a little bit?
Oh, I've not really. I've been reading through the history section because I found that area a lot more. There's a lot more compared to when I read Warmachine Prime. So obviously things have been developed and added in. Especially, I think a lot more to do with the early history and things that occurred before the Orgoth turned up. But why? What did you want? What were you particularly wanting to ask?
Well, I mean, I guess we can ask Simon because he's right here. Simon, could you talk about the archetypes and careers and kind of the flexibility that it brings to character creation?
Sure. When we first started developing the game, one of the things we found was that the careers we were looking at were not quite they weren't broad enough. And when we started broadening them, they started becoming too dilute and didn't make a whole lot of sense. One of our goals was to make the kind of hybrid and interesting and almost patched together characters that the Iron Kingdoms is famous for. And we realized that limiting ourselves to one career was not enough, so we actually made it so that you actually choose 2 careers at character creation, and these careers can be anything from soldier or to highwayman to investigator to warcaster, etc. And some of these things have prerequisites, some are limited to race, but the combinations of careers, there's literally hundreds of them that are available to a starting character, and you can make a really unique and very a character that really feels like he's part of the Iron Kingdoms. And as well as part of that, we have what are called archetypes. And you choose one archetype at creation that's either skilled, intellectual, mighty, or gifted, gifted being our magic users. And those give you access to some very powerful abilities. You gain more of those as your character increases in experience. And some careers are tied to specific archetypes. For example, Warcaster is a gifted archetype. And you have to have that archetype to have it. So there are a number of ways that career, archetype, and race all interact to make characters that make sense for the Iron Kingdoms.
Yeah, because I mean, I've just looking over the list. So obviously, you said you've gone through the archetypes there, and that some of the careers, as I said, gifted for like arcane mechanic or arcanist, but also some have required race, which really means you can, like, for example, you could get some really interesting combinations where you say have the pirate aristocrat or an explorer gun mage, and they kind of it's the thing that I've also noticed that towards the back of the section of character creation, you also have you have some group templates, essentially.
Adventuring companies.
Yeah, and so they give you suggestions of, your group should include at least, each character should be, say, in the case of the Pirates of the Broken Coast, a cutthroat, an explorer, or a military officer, or a pirate, or a thief. And again, I think having enough of those combinations means you can make quite a colourful history for your character, or at least make it plausible for how they've collected quite an interesting collection of skills. I think it's a real strength to it, rather than just being limited to one career.
Yeah, the adventuring companies, that was actually one of my few development babies in this book. I wrote setting material, but one of the things was we wanted to have the setting is, I think, the real jewel of our game, and it's what makes people want to play Iron Kingdoms over another fantasy role playing game, is that we have this extravagantly detailed world. So the adventuring companies are ways for players to encourage players to make groups of characters that make sense. Now, there's nothing stopping you from making a group with 2 Trollkin, a Gobber, an Iosin, and an Ogren, but that's not necessarily a very common sight in the Iron Kingdom. So we have the adventuring companies give you incentive by giving your group extra skills, sometimes extra abilities, but limit the choices of careers and races available to you. For example, the Arcane Order one is your characters are members of sort of a guild or a small arcane order, like the Fraternal Order of Wizardry or the Grey Lord's Covenant. Although we'll be revisiting both of them in Book 2, which we're currently in the midst of writing. In the very broad sense, the gifted characters who have the gifted archetype in the Arcane Order they're the full members of the order, and other characters are expected to be their bodyguards and retainers and stuff. And in this case, the characters actually get to start out with a small guild house. Any of the gifted characters get the Arcane Scholar ability. Everybody gets the level of the Arcane Lore ability, and non-gifted characters get the Shield Guard ability because they're the bodyguards. So this way, you kind of you get around the aspect of how do our characters know each other. It's laid out for you at the beginning.
Good stuff. All right, I think it's time that we start talking about the setting. We've teased you enough.
Yeah.
And wow, the Iron Kingdoms, it's huge. Even beyond the Iron Kingdoms as well, because the Iron Kingdoms is just a small portion of Western Immoren, and the Warmachine and Hordes games go beyond that as well. Simon, could you? I know this is going to be really tough, but could you give the basic tenets of the Iron Kingdoms, and what are the cool things that people will first notice?
Yeah, that's a tall order, but I think the first thing people are going to see about the Iron Kingdoms is that it's a world where magic and technology are not at war, but supplement each other, and that's through the art of what's called mechanica. And the idea is that magic is very dangerous and hard to use, and in fact, humanity was only given the gift of magic a few hundred years earlier to when they, more than a few hundred years earlier, but a relatively short time ago, as a gift of the goddess Thamar, who negotiated a questionable bargain with unknown parties to give them the ability to overthrow an occupying force called the Orgoth, who had been oppressing humanity for hundreds and hundreds of years. So because of that, she gave them what was called sort of an incomplete arcane alphabet. So they're actually, magic isn't like it is in a lot of other fantasy settings. It has very rote and specific uses. And characters can certainly experiment with it. Arcane geniuses in the world have, a much deeper theoretical notice. But for the most part, you aren't going to see utility magic like you do in other settings. But what happens there is because magic is difficult to use and because technology has limits, a lot of arcanists find ways to use one to sort of patch out the problems in the other, and that's where Mechanica comes in. One of the biggest expressions of Mechanica, most obvious ones, is the Steamjack, which is a big steam-powered robot with a magical brain called a Cortex. And the Cortex is a piece of Mechanica that's sort of unsurpassed. There's no pure use of magic that can even come close to the complexity and sophistication of the Cortex. And these things are manufactured, and steamjacks are used for labor, and militarized ones are called warjacks, and they're some of the most deadly engines of war in all of Western Emirate. So Mechanica is probably one of the big pillars of the setting. After that, we've got our nations of the Corvus Treaties, which are the nations that arose after the Orgoth occupation and immediately fell to disputing their borders. We set the game in the year 608 AR after Rebellion, and we have an ongoing meta plot that we update in Warmachine and Hordes, but we didn't want to have that overshadow the role-playing games. We want players to tell their own stories and not feel that they have to slavishly be devoted to the ongoing story in Warmachine and Hordes. So 608 AR made sense for us because in our ongoing story, it's only 2 years before the present in Warmachine, but it's at a time of relative ceasefire and temporary peace treaties between the nations, which means things are very tense between the countries, but it's a good time for adventuring. So those are some of the big things, I think. We have our different nations. They're all pretty fleshed out, and in fact, we're working on book 2, which gets into extreme detail on the 4 nations of the Corvus Treaty, which is Signar, Khador, Ord, the fallen country of Lael, which was invaded by Khador a few years earlier, and the Protectorate of Menoth, which is not one of the original Corvus Treaty nations, but is effectively one of the modern Iron Kingdoms. And we are writing huge amounts of history for those right now. In fact, as soon as I finish this interview, I'm going to go back to writing my first draft of the history of Ord, which will hopefully be the last chapter in the book.
Wow.
Cool. Good stuff.
Yeah. So if you have more specific questions, I'd be happy to answer, but otherwise I'm just going to ramble endlessly because I could talk about this probably for the next 6 hours.
I was going to pick out some things which, so having read the first section of the history of the main setting part in the book, which is all the history that brings us up to the present in the setting, and things that kind of stick out are the things that make it not like the vast majority of other fantasy settings out there. And in my mind, there are a few. I like the fantasy settings that make enough strides to push them away from a Tolkien-esque, typical fantasy setting. So for me, I found interesting that elves are not the oldest race, and also the interaction between them and their gods and humanity and the gods of humanity. And the same thing again with the Cricks and just the undead. Again, it's the more relatively speaking a newer problem to the world rather than being some truly ancient evil empire of undead or something like that. So I was just going to say, what other things would you pick out, or you want to expand on the conscious decisions to make certain elements of the setting quite unique from other fantasy settings out there?
I think in a lot of cases that's just arises because we have things that seem like they'll be a cool idea, not necessarily for the sake of doing something new. But we liked our elven idea because our elves, even though they were actually their gods made them after humanity, their gods did so because they felt they could improve upon humanity. So it's the idea that the elves are still sort of superior to humans is there. It's just been how they got there has been inverted, and they're rather upset with humanity because a certain faction called the Retribution of Syra within the Iosan government believes that a lot of their recent problems over the last 700 or 800 years stem from magic, from the gift of magic that humanity gained at the end of the Orgoth occupation. They think that's what sickened their gods and made their children start being born without souls. So some of those some of those Tolkien ideas and classic fantasy tropes are there. We've just tried to do things that seem like an interesting new twist on them. Again, I think magic and technology, they coexist in a lot of settings, but we wanted to have that not necessarily at war, but two different paths to the same goal that converge synergistically.
Yeah. No, I really do like the as you say, the subversion of classic fantasy tropes in there. The whole, of course, magic and technology being married together rather than being conflicting paths is great. And I think I'm just thinking there's other fantasy settings out there that I'm quite a big proponent of and enjoy. So I always like something that gives me something new to get my teeth into. What other highlights would you say that that also kind of make it different to a traditional fantasy game? I was thinking maybe how magic works. As I said, you say it's a far more almost scientific approach to magic rather than wizards kind of just learning and experimenting. It's very rigidly developed.
Yeah, even sorcerers who develop their powers rather simultaneously, they have access to relatively limited sets of skill pools. And I think we have two kinds of casters. We have our will weavers, who are the most common arcanists. And they can, in the game, they can mechanically cast extra spells or extend this power of their spells by gaining fatigue. And if they gain too much fatigue, they overexert themselves and can't cast for a round of combat. On the flip side, we have our focusers, which right now are only represented by warcasters, who are they have sort of a more intuitive control of magic. They always have a set amount of what are called focus points that they can use to cast their spells, and they can't overextend themselves like a will weaver will. But they can use these for a broader variety of things. They can use them to cast spells. They can use them to instinctively control warjacks. They can bond with mechanical weapons and get extra boosted dice of damage and things like that. So I think the way our actual arcanists use the arcane is a little different than you find in a lot of other settings. And I think another thing to point out is, we're very big on gunpowder, or blasting powder, as it's called in the Iron Kingdoms. So you'll see the classic fighter of fantasy role-playing games who has a sword and armor, he's still there in the Iron Kingdoms, but he's probably packing a pistol as a backup as well.
Yeah. And that actually brings us to something I think quite important, because I think it's quite easy for people maybe to look at the setting and think, oh, it's steampunk, but I really don't think it is, and it's just fantasy with steam power or with guns, because looking at the artwork and the style of it, I would put it akin to, say, it's almost kind of like if the Napoleonic warfare was all conducted with magical pistols and giant robots, and that's the feel that I get from the game, and really the look that I imagine for the stories I want to tell. So is that close to how you see it, or I think what I'm getting at is what kind of real world elements would you use to help players and people new to the game to color their to kind of paint the setting?
It's interesting, actually. That's a great question. We draw from a lot of different time periods, and we try to find the parts of history and the real world that sort of complement each other, even if there's big gaps of time. And while I would not say we have a simply steampunk setting, there are aspects of steampunk that appear in it. We have our steam-powered warjacks and steam-powered personal armor in some cases, but we're definitely not limited to the Victorian era. In fact, I'd say we draw very heavily, like you stated, upon the Napoleonic era as far as the look of some of our things, all the way up to World War I in some cases. Our Trencher Signarin unit, our Signarin trenching unit, they've got they're trench warriors. The soldiers, they have rifles with bayonets. They're wearing sort of light armor. They've got a very British doughboy look to them in some ways. On the other hand, we have Khador, which has kind of a Soviet aesthetic. It's got red armor and a yellow sigil, but their actual mode of government and lifestyle it's really quite similar to Imperial Russia in a lot of ways. It's not Soviet. They're not communists. They have an empress. they have sort of a pre-Soviet bureaucracy. I'm rather excited about Khador because we wrote their chapter for the new book a few weeks ago, and it was the first time I think we've really succeeded in portraying Khador as a living, breathing place. All 18 of the provinces are Volskaya, as they're called. We got into the politics of Khador, how the merchant princes, or the Kayazi, interact with the great princes and the empress, and I think it has this real 19th century Russian feel, but not Victorian, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we have other places like the Protectorate of Menoth, which has a very they're a theocracy, so they have very religious overtones to the looks of their stuff. So we kind of pick and choose what we think looks cool together and what makes sense together. Sometimes the contrast is actually what makes it interesting, but in a lot of cases it's just because we in our world it makes sense for our Napoleonic guys, halberdiers and pistolmen, to be fighting alongside a unit of trench soldiers. And we strive to make those things look like they exist in the same world. And sometimes it's not quite as much work as you'd think. It's interesting a lot of the places that history brushes up against itself.
Oh yeah, I mean, you only have to look at some of the weaponry that was being developed even in the late Renaissance. You'd have literally Gatling muskets. So it's not too much to imagine. Well, if you had a bit of magic in there and a bit more time to play about with these things, or the right technologies come together, then you can see these weapons emerging, but in a place that stylistically it seems out of place, but actually it would be a natural extension of what was developed in the real world. So that's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's very interesting with the Iron Kingdoms is that in a lot of ways it's a world on the verge of a real industrial revolution. It's happening, but if you move the setting forward 50 years, it might be a very different place. And I think it's interesting. One of the cool things about this thing is that we have this tension of everything's about to change, but it's 5, 10, 15 years off. But from our modern standpoint, you can sort of say, oh, well, these guys are doing this. That's probably going to lead to this thing, and what is that going to do to the balance of power? And I think it's really fascinating to kind of keep the world poised at this this precipice of discovery and innovation.
Yeah, because I mean, I even read in one bit there's even a brief mention of I was waiting for it. I knew it would turn up somewhere in the history section, but of an airship or a dirigible. So I'm looking forward to seeing a bit more in some of the later books to do with the technology, and obviously what kind of dangerous air transport technology has been developed.
Oh, no, so far it's only been done once, and that was the deposed former king of Signar, Vinterrail escaped in what was essentially a hot air balloon, which promptly crashed in the middle of the Bloodstone Desert.
Yes.
So it worked out for him, but it was very short term and probably not the most successful venture. But who knows what the future will hold.
Now, the other thing. So, keeping on that theme, would you say, because this again kind of keeping with the idea of inspiration, I've been really kind of racking my brains with stuff to suggest for people to kind of get into the field of running Iron Kingdoms or what to reference. And I think there's quite a few either books or music or movies or novels or computer games that have inspired you. So is there anything that's kind of like you would suggest to people, like, oh, if you watch that, you might get a bit of a feel for kind of the type of stories you could run in the setting, or just to get the mood right, or even just what music you think really fits for a soundtrack to someone's gaming session?
I mean, it's a big question. One of the things I advise people is that even the core book, especially the core book, it's a big setting, and I think it's probably a mistake to try and use all of it at once.
Yes.
What I tell people is look at pick a corner of the world that you want to explore, or a theme of the world that you want to explore, and kind of build your game around that. And look at the adventuring companies. We're going to be posting more of those, in future books and magazines. And try and narrow the focus of your game to well, I want to set a game in occupied Lael, and I want to be resistance fighters, and what is the theme of this? The theme is going to be desperate choices. And once I had a few ideas about that, that's when I would start looking for, books and music and movie inspiration. I think there's a lot of good ways you could do that. I think, if just using the Lily's resistance thing, one way you could theme that is, they're sort of behind enemy lines and, conducting sort of strange espionage or, assassinations of Cadoran occupiers. And, I might look to a movie like Munich for how a cell operates, in secret. Or I might look for movies about the World War II and the French Resistance for that kind of thing. And I think, I would even look at Battlestar Galactica. I think it was the second or third season where they have this silent occupation going on.
Yeah.
And I think as we just finished writing the Lely's stuff last week, and I think that was definitely an inspiration for parts of the stuff I wrote. That sort of desperate resistance cell. So I think those are three different sort of takes on a similar subject, and I would look for inspiration. What kind of story I wanted to tell, and then go look for the movies and books that speak to that. And I would definitely look outside of fantasy fiction for it, because I think there's a lot of really good real world stuff that you're really going to draw upon, and that's where our core ideas often come from, is actual history. And if you look at real heroes and villains from almost any era of history, you're going to find great things that make sense in the Iron Kingdoms.
Because I was going to say, like, movies that have already kind of like the first movie that came to mind when I started flicking through Iron Kingdoms, and I read about the Kingdom of Ord, was like, with all the swampy marsh grounds and everything. I was like, yep, I kind of need to rewatch Brotherhood of the Wolf and the whole, the myth of Gévaudan and people, the hunter coming from Paris. And it's just like, it immediately has that kind of look, because you've got that kind of mix of myth and wariness of locals with some guys from the big city that have got some muskets and it just seemed kind of perfect for that.
Yeah, that story in particular. I know Jason Souls is a huge fan of film. I quite like it myself, so I guarantee you that there's that film's DNA shows up in a couple places in our game.
And another one which I thought of, which simply just has quite excellent visuals. I mean, obviously Pirates of the Caribbean, for anything involving like the anything to do with pirates in the setting,
sure.
I think fits perfectly. And I think even if you want to go a bit crazy, like with the weaponry, if you want to see weaponry taken to the extreme, was the most recent. It depends how much people like it. The Three Musketeers movie. It's again has insane levels of technology for the historical setting it's meant to be, but I think acts as another good bit of inspiration for how you can go with like personalized weapons that have mechanical contraptions built in.
Yeah, no, I think there are parts of the aesthetic of that film that are definitely very Iron Kingdoms, or would work in it. I think the overall look of that movie is probably a little bit more high fantasy than we'd be going for, but it's there in places for sure.
Is there any music you would have said that kind of? Is there any particular bits of music you would have said that fits either the game in general or a particular region? Anything that people should look for?
I'm probably a bad person to ask, because I listen to a lot of music when I write, so that stuff tends to be almost arbitrarily whichever albums I'm listening to when I'm writing a certain portion of the game gets sort of stuck in my head, and that's what I think of as the soundtrack for that region. So I don't know how helpful that would be for the average person's gaming table. Like I think I listened to Chelsea Wolfe's 2 albums back to back for days, driving my office mate crazy while writing Ord and Lael. But it's kind of spooky. Ord's a pretty haunted place, so that could work in some places. But I don't know if the average gaming table is really going to find that to be very conducive to rolling some dice. I absolutely think of Godspeed You Black Emperor when I'm playing or writing anything Cadoran. So that's pretty atmospheric.
Mike, anything else you wanted to ask on to do with the setting or?
Oh boy, man, there's a lot.
So much.
So we set this up 2 weeks ago, and pretty much for the past 2 weeks, in my free time, I've just been reading about the Iron Kingdoms. Jeez, I mean, gun mages are so awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what we should talk about? Because dragons. They're in like every fantasy setting, except for a couple. But dragons are way different in the Iron Kingdoms or in Imran. So, Simon, could you kind of explain those a little bit and what's going on with them?
Sure. The first dragon in Imran is Toruk, or the Dragon Father, and nobody's entirely sure how he came to be. There's a lot of the few people who are sort of in the know on bigger cosmological issues think he may be from sort of outside of reality, although that's obviously not something most people even think about. But wherever he came from, Torek showed up several thousand years ago and ran around the planet, around Western Imran. He got bored after a time and decided that he needed somebody to talk to, so he decided to create a brood by which he took out his Athank heart, which is basically a gigantic crystal, and carved shards of it out, each of these shards giving birth to a new dragon. Predictably, they weren't too keen on Torek, and they started warring with each other and eventually sort of formed an alliance to try and devour him. Since then, he killed a number of them and scoured the rest into hiding places around the world. Now, Torek, I should point out, he's large for a dragon. He's, I don't know, probably 1,000 feet tall, something like that. He's a big guy. And after he killed a number of his children and drove the rest into hiding, he flew off to the island of the Shard Islands, where he founded the necromantic empire of Krix, where the few humans in Satixis, who are sort of our satyr women, worship him as a god, and the undead are his favorite minions. That's where the Iron Liches of Iron Kingdom's fame come from. Since then, the lesser dragons have been sort of plotting against him. They're all keen, they'd all like to sort of devour each other, because anytime they do that, they gain the Athank of the other. So they all sort of hate and distrust each other, but they hate Torek more. And one of his children, Ethrenbol, better known as Everblight, recently founded his own army in an attempt to not only eventually devour his father, but all of his siblings as well. And that's one of our Hordes factions, the Legion of Everblight, who are these blighted. Just by being near a dragon, you're exposed almost to like sort of a soul poison or a cancer of the mind and body. And Everblight's quite good at controlling this blight, where he's wrecked the Nis elves, who were the winter elves, lived in North. He's destroyed and sublimated most of their population. And he's sort of a growing problem in the North that not everybody's figured out is even there yet. So our dragons they're a little different. They're not something that the average adventuring party in the RPG is ever going to be able to prepare to deal with, because they're forces of nature. So that's kind of our take on dragons.
Cool, good stuff. All right, I think that's quite a good detail on the setting itself. So I kind of want to ask Simon a little bit about where are the plans going forward. I know we have a couple of hardcover books coming out. Definitely going to be some stuff in the No Quarter magazine from Privateer Press, but is there anything else you've got planned coming up?
Well, our basic thing is we have a set of 4, we're calling them core books, although the first book is all you actually need to play the game. The remaining 3 books we're going to take detailed looks at portions of the setting, add extra monsters, add additional playable content, but they're not core rules, if that makes sense. But those 4 books will be coming out over the next probably 18 months. We're finishing up writing on the second one right now. I believe it is tentatively titled Kings, Nations, and Gods, and that's going to examine the nations of the Corvus Treaties, being Signar, Khador, Ord, Occupied Lael, and the Protectorate of Menoth, with new careers, gear, adventuring companies, all that good stuff, as well as extremely detailed histories and present-day looks at the setting. I think anybody who read our old Iron Kingdom's World Guide is going to be really happy with this book, because the level of detail we're getting into is much, much higher, as well as some really awesome new maps of the setting. Hopefully that's going to be out in the spring of 2013. We're currently on track for that, so that shouldn't be too far down the road. After that, Book 3 is going to be look at the wilderness of Western Imran, and that's going to introduce rules for warlocks and war beasts, new players, and who control these giant beasts of the wild, as well as a whole bunch of new monsters. I think we're going to add some new playable races there for people who want to play a game of old Gatormen, or bog trogs, things like that. We're probably going to have rules for
Gatormen. Did I hear that right? Gatormen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. I'm sold.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. I mean, and the idea with that is not that you're going to drop these Gatormen into your existing campaign. Is that we're going to provide a way that if you want to tell a story about a Gatorman tribe and their bog trog slaves out in the wilderness, we're going to give you the tools to do that and play on the other side of the field. We'll probably be doing the same with the Legion of Everblight, so you can play Legion warlocks and bladedness and stuff. Because we think it's, I think we've got all these very cool sort of alternate races and weird takes on fantasy and stuff. And while they're not part of the, the core Iron Kingdoms, they're still fun things for players to check out. And we're pretty excited to give people a chance to tell very different kinds of fantasy world stories, more tribal or wilderness based. The Druids of the Circle Orboros will be in that book too. And then we're going to stuff it with a whole bunch of new monsters for game masters to use. That's book 3. I don't have dates on that yet. That's still a ways off.
Yeah.
And then book 4, which will be the final of the core 4 books, is going to take a look at the ancient empires of Western Emerald, or actually of Emerald, I should say. Those being the Nightmare Empire of Crix, the Dwarven Empire of Rule, the Nation of Ios, who are elves, and the Scorn Empire to the east. And again, we're going to introduce new playable content for all that. So if you want to play a party of all Scorn and take part in invading the Iron Kingdoms, you'll be able to do that, or tell stories based in Crix, things like that. So that's our core line of books. Beyond that, we're definitely going to be supporting the game in every issue of No Quarter Magazine pretty heavily. New adventures, new articles. I just wrote a new article, myself, Jason Souls, and one of my forum moderators, Kyle Hagen, who's an engineer, wrote a brief but cool article explaining, the logistics of using your Steam Jack, how much coal you need, what does it cost to buy coal in bulk, how do you get a Steam Jack from place to place across a large distance economically. So we're going to be doing stuff like that, and then we're trying out our first Iron Kingdoms magazine supplement, which will be coming out in December under No Quarter Magazine. That's going to be nothing but Iron Kingdoms role-playing game content, and it's called Iron Kingdoms Urban Adventures. And it's going to have a whole bunch of new articles, adventures that are going to detail Iron Kingdoms games set in the cities of Western Emerald, or specifically of the Iron Kingdoms. So hopefully we'll be doing more stuff like that. We've already published a free PDF adventure that was one of my babies, Fools Rush In. Anybody who was at Gen Con may have had a chance to play that. If you go to privateerpress.com/ironkingdoms/downloads, you'll be able to find it there. And that's it has full quick start rules, pre-generated characters, new art, and a full adventure and all the player handouts you need to run a game without even having the books. So if you want to check out the Iron Kingdoms, that's a great place to start. And hopefully we'll be doing more web stuff like that. And before you guys ask, we are not currently publishing digitally, but we are very aggressively exploring digital publishing options. So hopefully we'll have more to talk about on that in the not-too-distant future.
Yes, digital will be great because it's a heavy book. And
yes, it is.
If the others are going to be like that, to have them available digitally will be a boom. That would be excellent. And also, something I'll point out, because this came up in a comment on Reddit about Iron Kingdoms, that one of the downloads you have available is actually more beasts and monsters that didn't make it into the core book. So
yes.
which is just useful for people to know.
On our downloads page, we have a whole bunch we have character sheets, we have some game master sheets, extra monsters. We have bases you can print out, so you don't need to buy plastic bases to use your guys in the game, and a bunch of just helpful things for GMs and players alike.
Ah, classic. You've actually got printable bases. So just printable bases. So if you haven't got the relevant miniature, or you haven't decided to invest in miniatures, just gone, I need miniatures for this combat because it's so freaking insane.
Correct.
You can just brilliant. That's awesome. That is absolutely awesome. I have memories of Warhammer Quest and thinking it's a pain when you don't have a monster or you don't have space, and just knowing that you're supporting like people that may decide to use the actual miniature based route for combat. That's great. Wow.
Yeah, no, we want to make it as easy for people to get into as possible. I think people often ask, how do we draw our maps? In the office, we mostly use butcher paper, and we just draw out our battle maps, throw down our bases. If we have miniatures, we use them. If we don't, we don't. We use the cut-out bases. One of the bonuses of working in a miniatures gaming company is you have a lot of miniatures around.
Yes.
But not everybody does, and while we think it adds a little bit to the game to have cool representations for your guys, we don't expect people to go out and bodge together 20 city watchmen for their one encounter. Right? So you print out your bases, maybe you do a little drawing on there, you just number them or something, and it's pretty easy to use.
Will you be? Is there also going to be more miniature support, or like some box sets that represent, say, just a selection of the types of characters that will exist that would be useful for the Iron Kingdom setting, but may not be applicable to the war game directly, or things like that?
Right now, we do still have our old Iron Kingdoms miniatures line, but we're not currently planning on expanding that. But, one of the things we did in the introductory adventure that I was talking about earlier, we had cut out standees. so
Yeah.
that we just offer as printouts. So it's possible, as we publish more adventures, we may do more stuff like that as digital extras, things like that.
I was going to ask about those because I think I think that's a really nice route to represent lots of grunts for
Sure.
that you want to kill, and obviously if people want to invest in miniatures for the main characters and some badass that they're after, then it makes it the best of all worlds. What else have we got in store? So, is there any plans for any novels in the future to kind of pad out the Iron Kingdoms? Can we expect that?
I don't know what the deal with that is at this time. We're definitely, we know our audience would love to read some novels. It's definitely a possible thing we could be doing in the future, but right now I don't have any information about it.
Okay. And I do know that there is a computer game in development, but that's in development, which is generally there's nothing really to say. Just that it's being developed.
Not much information.
Exactly. Cool. Mike, any other things you want to finish up with?
I was kind of curious if you guys might be doing anything with cards. It doesn't sound like it, but one of the cool things about the Warmachine and Hordes tabletop games is that you use cards to keep track of the stats for your monsters and all that kind of stuff. It seems like it would be great for a game master to have like a set of cards for all the different creatures that might be in an encounter, that kind of stuff.
Well, actually, if you go to that downloads page, like I said, there is a Game Master's sheet that basically it has unfilled fields with all that information for the GM to use. So, it's not exactly a card; it's laid out. That information is laid out there in multiples for basically that specific use.
Yeah, Mike. I say, flicking to the back of my book here. Essentially, the life spiral that's used in Hordes.
Yep.
That's the way it works for characters.
Yeah,
Okay?
I saw that. That's a really cool idea.
So there's a page at the back which is obviously available digitally. So you can list 1 to 12 creatures and have their vitality and status effects, and then you have because you don't use the life spirals for grunts, but then you've got life spirals for actual named antagonists. So you've got a sheet that you can print off which has room for everything. So it's essentially a cut down way of representing characters, which is great.
Sounds good.
And also something I was going to say, can we expect some nice apps through for the iPhone and Android? Because something that a friend of mine told me, because they're actually playing some Warmachine right now with my miniatures I left back in the UK. I donated them while I moved country. They've got the War Room app, which essentially allows you to digitally manage your armies for Warmachine and Hordes. So can we expect possibly apps for that are useful within the roleplay game for, again, like management of characters or for games masters to manage their campaign?
I don't have specific information on anything like this time, but War Room was definitely a very big success for us and continues to be. So
great.
We are definitely exploring ideas, but at this time, I don't know. We don't really have anything lined up at this point, but I expect that's going to change at some point down the road.
Great. And of course, the one thing I wanted to say is that Colossals is insane, because that came out relatively recently. That's just
June.
The minutes out of that are just brilliant. So yeah. So is there? I'm going to guess there might be something of that magnitude possibly for Hordes. I'd hate to see what giant monsters.
Oh, we've already the Gargantuans. We've already started releasing.
Oh yeah.
For the Trolls came out September.
Ah, right. There's so much I need to catch up on, really.
Yeah. And that book, Gargantuans, will be out. The book will be out in March, along with a whole bunch of other new Hordes models that you'll start seeing early next year.
Brilliant. Oh, and the other thing,
we're already working on the next big thing for Warmachine, so there's some cool stuff coming down the road for our miniatures gamers as well. And of course, if you're just an RPG guy, those books still have a lot of cool background and history and setting. That I think it has some application to the RPG.
Cool, Mike. Any last things there?
Not really. Definitely excited to check this stuff out. Oh, wait.
We do have one last
I see what
thing.
you're doing right there. Okay. Simon, we have a question that we ask every guest the first time they're on the show.
Yes.
So, if you could be a household appliance, which would you be and why?
it's sort of a tie between, the utility of my coffee maker or the refrigerator where I keep my beer. Being able to self-supply either of those would be really good, although I suppose the refrigerator requires me to put the beer in it. So the coffee maker is probably the more utilitarian answer.
I would go with coffee maker as well, because then you could actually just put alcohol in the coffee as well.
That's an excellent point.
Cafe Corretto is the way forward. Anyway, that's brilliant. Yes, coffee maker. I think everyone should know that's what I would choose as well. I think it's a brilliant choice. Cool. So, Mike, I guess that's everything. So, Simon, do you have any particular websites and places you would like to plug, and things that if people want to contact you, or any events that are coming up that people should be aware of?
For all of that stuff, the best place to go is actually privateerpress.com and Privateer Press on Facebook, which you can find just from searching for us. And if you want to stay up to date on what we're doing there, or at Privateer Press on Twitter. Those three
you have a
places.
Google Plus as well.
Yes, we also are on Google.
Yes.
If you type Privateer Plus is any of our homes on the web is the best place to stay up to date on what we've got going on. We have new events coming out. If you're really excited and getting into even the role-playing game, I recommend checking out our Press Gang volunteer program. So much of our success has been because of our volunteers who demo all of our games all over the world. Get new people excited. And having been a former Press Ganger myself, I just say it's a blast and a great program to be a participant in. We've got some really exciting stuff coming up for those guys in the next couple of years. And it's a great time to be a privateer player, I think.
Cool. It's also important to bring up that when Simon is not wearing his pirate hat, he's actually wearing a gas mask and adventuring in the unhallowed metropolis.
Yes, myself and Jason Souls, who is the lead developer of the Iron Kingdoms role-playing game, and our co-creator Nicole Vega, we work on a game called Unhallowed Metropolis, the gas mask chic role-playing game of neo-Victorian horror. Sort of a neo-Victorian zombie apocalypse, and I can't get into that too much today, but I'd be happy to come back and talk to you guys about that some other time.
Oh yes, please. That's basically I have two books that I'm going through slowly and happen to be written that you've been involved in. I was also going to note that you also both of those books share the same artwork by is it Brian
Snowdy's worked on both of those.
Yeah. So again, that it just shows that the great quality of artwork and design appears in both of those role-play games. So again, if people are familiar with the one, they should really look at the other for the artwork and what's in there. Great.
Cool. All right, Simon, thank you very much for taking some time out of your busy Friday to come on the show and speak with us. Of course, if anyone wants to get in contact with Dark Days Radio, check out our Facebook or send us an email over at darkdaysradio@gmail.com. We'd love to hear any feedback on this show or any general World of Darkness stuff. So, with that, I think that's the end of the show.
Yep. It's been
Thanks so
a
much,
pleasure.
guys.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Cheers.